Hi, everybody. Today we are going to talk about CSS. So there are three ways that we can use CSS in an HTML document. So let me share my screen so you can see what I'm talking about. So here, I just want to explain to you the three different ways to use CSS inside your HTML web page. The first way is the inline CSS. You have to put the style attribute inside the element that you want to apply the CSS to. The other way is the embedded document level CSS. You're going to use not the style attribute this time, but the style element with an opening and a closing style tags. And it has to be inside the head part of the HTML. And the other one is the external CSS. It's when you create an external CSS file that it will end by .css, and then you use the link tag in the head part of your HTML to import, to bring that CSS file to your HTML page. I'm going to show a simple example to you, and then at the end, I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Okay. In this course, we are going to learn CSS using the inline CSS. Okay, so let's talk about showing to you an example. So here I have a simple web page that I decided to use inline CSS. You don't see any style element inside the head, and you don't see any link element inside the head, but you see the style attribute inside the heading one. Now, when I put an attribute, I put the equal sign, and then between double quotes, I put the value of the style attribute. Now, that value can be like only one CSS property, okay, that generally is formed by the CSS property, then colon, then the value of that CSS property, and at the end, the semicolon. Okay. Now, if I want to put another CSS property, then I give a space and I put another CSS property. Again, the CSS property here is color, and then I have the colon. Okay, then I have the value, which is, in this case, it's the deep pink color. As you can see in the VS Code, the web editor, it even brings to you what color is going to be used. Now, I also put more inline CSS in other elements, the heading 2, where I put the style attribute, and now I'm using the border CSS property, which I have to give the color of the border, how many pixels that color, that border is going to be, and the style of that border, if it's going to be dotted or if it's going to be solid, okay? And there are other styles for border. Here in the paragraph, I'm using also the style attribute, and now I'm using the font size as the CSS property. And when I use font size, I prefer to use the relative unit, EM, or percentage, or REM, okay? So here I'm using 1.3 EM, which multiplies like the size of normal browser font size, which generally it's 1 EM. So it's adding something to it. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be 1.3 EM. Okay. Now, this is the inline way. Now, note that because I have two paragraphs and I want them to have the same font size, I had to apply the style attributes for the two paragraphs. If I had 50 paragraphs, I would have to apply the style attribute for each one of those 50 paragraphs. Okay, so that's the disadvantage of using inline CSS. The advantage of using inline CSS is that you can see exactly to the element when the CSS is applied. So opening the browser, I can see here the font, the color of the font applied to the heading 1, and I can see that it's italic because I applied the font style italic, okay? Inline CSS. Now, the heading 2, I'm applying a border. So as you can see, it's applying a border to the whole heading 2, okay? Now, for the paragraphs, I applied the style of font size 1.3 EM. That's why the font size is bigger than in this paragraph here that I have. I mean, for the footer, I do not have a paragraph, but if I had a paragraph in the footer here, you would see that it would be bigger. Those other footer over there would be bigger because of the, see, of the inline that I applied to those two, the inline CSS, okay? Now, if I wanted to use the embedded, I could put in the head I could put in the head here, I could put the style element here, okay? And then I could have my CSS inside here, okay? Now note that in this case here, I have to apply the CSS, okay, to be in a different way than when I'm using the inline CSS. See, I apply using the element, which we call selector in the CSS, then the curly braces, and those curly braces, they will be involving how many CSS I want to apply to that selector. In that case, I'm saying for the heading 1, every time the browser sees a heading 1 on my page, it will apply font style italic and the color deep pink. When it sees the heading 2, it's going to apply the border. When it sees a paragraph, it's going to apply the font size. So note that now I can get rid of any of those inline CSS I had before because I'm using the external CSS. So I can get rid of the style attribute that I had used in my elements. Another interesting point to note here is that when I'm using the embedded CSS, I can have only one paragraph mentioned here, okay, with the font size. So note here, I'm going to save this file now, and I'm going to refresh, okay? and it has the same thing. But note one detail. Now the footer paragraph is the same size. Why? Because now it's an embedded CSS, and it's applying the font size to any paragraph I have, okay? So if I don't want the paragraph in the footer to be the same size of the other paragraphs, then I just remove this paragraph mark, okay, from here. And if I save and refresh, see, now only those two paragraphs inside the article, they have 1.3 EM of font size. The paragraph inside the footer, the content inside the footer does not have that font size applied because now I don't have the paragraph anymore inside the footer, okay? Now, if I had an external CSS, so here is the example.css I created, okay, with an external. So what I would do, I could delete this style element from here, and instead of the style element, what I could have would be a link tag that would be written that way. I have the link, and then I have the href attribute that will link to my CSS, to the external CSS. What this tag is doing here, what this tag is saying is, bring the example CSS to be part of my HTML document. So the example CSS is all of these here, all of those CSS properties, okay? So if I save this with the external, you're going to see that the same thing happens, okay? So I have inline, I have embedded, and I have the external. The advantage of the external is that once I create the .css file, I can use in many different web pages, in many different .html documents I have, okay? While the embedded is valid only to that particular page, okay? So when I'm using the style element in the head, and I put like the second example that I showed to you, it would be valid only to that HTML document. If I wanted to apply that same style, I would have to copy that embedded CSS to the other HTML document. And the disadvantage of the inline is that you have to apply the CSS to each and every element using the style attribute, okay? And it's gonna be valid only to that element, the CSS. It's gonna be used, not valid, it's gonna be used, okay? So that's the way that the three different ways that you can apply CSS. And so see you next time where we are going to learn the many different CSS properties. Bye.